The year is 1942, a cold German morning. Frost on the stone walls, breath turning to mist in the air. Inside a courtyard surrounded by barbed wire and guard towers, hundreds of British prisoners of war stand in neat rows. They have been standing here for 2 hours. 2 full hours. The German commandant ordered an inspection. The British officers refused to cooperate. And now, the commandant himself has stepped into the courtyard. His boots are polished to a mirror shine. His medals catch the pale winter light. His jaw is set like iron. He has done this 100 times. He has broken men in 100 camps. He believes, no, he knows that he is God in this place. He walks slowly between the rows, hands clasped behind his back, eyes scanning every face for weakness, for fear, for submission. And then he stops, right in front of one man, senior British officer, straight back, calm eyes, not a flicker of fear. The commandant stares. The British officer stares back, not with anger, not with hatred, with something far more dangerous, with complete and total contempt. A thin smile crosses the British officer's lips, not a smile of defeat, not a smile of someone trying to survive. It is the smile of a man who has already won. The commandant steps closer. His voice drops low. You will show respect. The British officer does not move, does not blink. Then, slowly, deliberately, he turns his head and looks away, like the commandant is not even worth his attention, like he is nothing, like he is furniture. The silence in that courtyard is absolute. Every prisoner watches. Every guard watches. Nobody breathes. And in that single moment, in front of everyone, the most powerful man in the camp realizes something that will eat him alive for the rest of his time there. He has already lost. He just does not know it yet. This is the story of how a group of British prisoners of war, men with no weapons, no freedom, no power, psychologically destroyed the men who held them captive. This is the story of how the British POWs of Colditz Castle did not just survive their imprisonment. They turned it into a war of its own. A war fought with smirks and silence and mockery so sharp it cut deeper than any blade. A war they won completely. And this is the story of the day that a Nazi general stood in front of men he was supposed to control and heard the words that ended him. You are no longer in charge. To understand why this story matters, you have to understand where it happened. Not just any prisoner of war camp. Colditz, Oflag IV-C, a castle that had stood since the 11th century on a rocky cliff above the Mulde River in Saxony, Germany. The Germans chose Colditz deliberately. They chose it because it was supposed to be inescapable. Its walls were meters thick. Its cliff dropped 40 meters on 3 sides. It was surrounded by multiple rings of guards, searchlights, and wire. The German High Command had a specific use for Colditz. It was designed as a Sonderlager, a special camp, not for ordinary prisoners, for the troublemakers, for the escape artists, for the officers who had already broken out of other camps, who had already caused chaos in other facilities, who had already proven that they were not ordinary men. If you ended up in Colditz, it was because you had already been a problem, which meant the population of Colditz was extraordinary. It was a collection of the most determined, the most resourceful, the most psychologically resilient officers the Allied forces had. French aristocrats, Dutch commandos, Polish aviators, and at the center of everything, the British contingent. Officers who had been educated in schools that taught them one thing above everything else. That status is not given. It is taken. That authority must be earned. And that a man in a uniform is not automatically worthy of respect. The German administration at Colditz was run, at various points, by a succession of commandants who arrived with the same attitude and left with something considerably less. But the story that defines Colditz, the story of psychological destruction, of authority collapsing under the weight of systematic contempt, is centered on one particular period. The period when the German commanders still believed they could control these men. When they still thought that enough rules, enough punishments, enough displays of power would bend the British officers into submission. They were wrong, and the process of discovering how wrong they were was, for the German command, a slow and humiliating unraveling. The commandant of the early Colditz years arrived with the confidence of a man who had managed prisoners before. He was precise. He was disciplined. He was proud of his record. He had run a tight camp before. He had kept order. He had maintained German superiority in every interaction with his prisoners. He arrived at Colditz and looked at the castle and looked at the guards and looked at the records of the men inside, and he thought, I can handle this. I have handled worse. He was the representative of the greatest military machine in the history of Europe. These were defeated soldiers, beaten men, prisoners. The hierarchy was clear. The power was clear. He was in charge. And this belief, this absolute, unshakable belief in his own authority, was the first thing the British officers went to work on. The first thing you need to understand about the British officers at Colditz is that they were not trying to survive. Survival was the minimum. What they were actually doing was something far more sophisticated. They had created a parallel world inside the camp. A world where German authority was not recognized, not challenged with violence, not fought openly, simply not recognized. The German orders existed. The German guards existed. The German rules existed. But the British officers had decided, collectively, to treat all of it as a kind of absurd theater. A performance by people who had confused the set of a play for the real world. And they watched this performance with the patient amusement of an audience that knows the script, knows the ending, and is simply waiting for the actors to catch up. This attitude showed itself in small ways first. The way British officers would respond to a guard's command, not immediately, but after a pause. Just long enough to make it clear that they were choosing to comply, not being forced to. The way they would look at a guard while he was speaking. Not at his eyes, but slightly past them, as if something more interesting existed just over his shoulder. The way they would laugh. Not at a joke, not at anything visible, but just laugh quietly among themselves whenever a German officer entered a room. Not enough to be punished. Just enough to make the German officer wonder what was funny, what they had missed, whether they were the joke. These were not accidents. They were coordinated. The senior British officers at Colditz ran their resistance campaign with the same professionalism they would have brought to any military operation. Every act of psychological warfare was deliberate. Every insult was engineered. Every moment of contempt was choreographed to land at exactly the right time, in exactly the right way, to cause exactly the right amount of damage to the German command's belief in its own power. The first major incident, the one that began the real process of psychological destruction, happened during a routine inspection. The German commandant had ordered a full parade. Every prisoner was to stand in the courtyard at a specific time, in neat rows, and be counted. This happened every day, twice a day. It was called Appell. It was the primary mechanism by which the Germans asserted control. You stand when I say stand. You wait when I say wait. You are counted like livestock, and you accept this because I am in charge and you are not. The British officers had been complying with Appell, mostly, because the senior officer had calculated that direct refusal was not yet the right move. But on this particular day, the commandant arrived with a visiting German general. A man from Berlin, someone important enough that the commandant wanted to show him how well run the camp was, how effectively he maintained order, how completely he controlled his prisoners. The British senior officer saw the visiting general, saw the commandant's eagerness to impress, understood immediately what this moment meant to the German command, and made a decision. When the commandant called the parade to attention, the British officers moved, but slowly, casually, as if they had just remembered they had somewhere slightly more important to be, and this was an inconvenient interruption. They did not snap to attention. They strolled. They adjusted their uniforms at their own pace. A few of them stopped to finish conversations before taking their places. One officer paused to light a cigarette. The commandant was watching. The visiting general was watching. Every guard was watching. And the British officers moved with the unhurried ease of men attending a social event they had not particularly wanted to go to. When they finally stood in their rows, they did not stand to attention. They stood in the casual, relaxed posture of men who were standing because they had chosen to, not because they had been ordered to. The commandant's face was rigid. He wanted to shout. He wanted to punish every single one of them. But he was in front of a visiting general from Berlin. He could not afford to lose control. He could not afford to look like a man whose prisoners did not respect him. So he said nothing. He completed the inspection. He counted the men. And the visiting general watched all of it. And his expression did not change. And he said nothing, and he left. And the commandant stood in his office afterward and understood that something had happened. That something had been taken from him in front of the one audience he had most needed to impress. He could not name it exactly, but it felt like authority. It felt like the thing that made people obey not because they had to but because they believed you had the right to be obeyed. And he was not sure he had it anymore. The second incident was more deliberate, more targeted, and it showed how sophisticated the British psychological campaign had become. The German command had a weakness that the British officers had identified early. The German military culture of the time was deeply invested in ritual, in the performance of rank, in visible public demonstrations of hierarchy. This was not specific to the Nazis, it was a deep feature of German military tradition. Officers expected certain behaviors from their inferiors, a certain way of standing, a certain way of speaking, a certain deference that was expressed in posture, in tone, in the physical distance maintained when addressing a superior. The British officers understood this perfectly, and they began to use it, not by refusing to perform these rituals. That would have been too crude, too direct, too easy to punish. Instead, they performed the rituals incorrectly, just slightly incorrectly, not enough to be a clear violation, just enough to be wrong in a way that the German officers felt but could not precisely articulate. When a German officer entered a room and the prisoners were expected to stand, they would stand, but they would stand at a pace and with a posture that communicated something different. When they were required to salute, they would salute, but with an angle or a timing that was off enough to feel disrespectful without being technically incorrect. They learned the boundaries of every rule and then performed everything at those boundaries. Always on the right side of punishment, always on the wrong side of genuine respect. And the German officers found this maddening, because they could see they were being mocked. They could feel the contempt in every interaction, but they could rarely point to a specific thing and say, "This is the violation, this is the punishment." The mockery was baked into the compliance itself. It was everywhere and nowhere, and this is what began to truly destabilize the German command at Colditz. Not the escape attempts, not the open defiance, but the knowledge that they were being continuously, methodically, expertly humiliated by men they were supposed to have broken. The third incident was the one that made the commandant understand the true nature of the war being fought inside his walls. It happened in the context of one of the many absurd rules the German administration imposed in an attempt to reassert control after each small defeat. The commandant had issued a directive that British officers were required to acknowledge German officers when passing them in corridors. A small thing, a rule about a nod, about a basic recognition of German authority in the physical space of the camp. The British senior officer considered this directive. He did not refuse it. He wrote a formal response, polite, correct, in proper military language, acknowledging the directive and confirming that it would be observed. The commandant was surprised. He had expected resistance. He had expected the usual slow, grinding negotiation. But the British senior officer had simply agreed. Too easily. The next day, in the corridors, the commandant found out why. Every British officer he passed acknowledged him, with complete, formal, elaborate military courtesy. Salutes that were technically correct and performed with such exaggerated precision that they became parodies. Acknowledgements that were delivered in a tone of such studied, solemn sincerity that they were obviously performances. Every German officer who walked those corridors that day was met with the same thing. Impeccable, correct, unmistakably sarcastic compliance. The commandant could not punish it. Every rule had been followed. Every requirement had been met. But the experience of being acknowledged in that way, by those men, was more corrosive than any insult. Because it communicated something with perfect clarity. We see exactly what you are doing. We are watching you perform your authority. And we are performing our compliance. And both of us know that none of this is real. That you do not have actual authority over us. That you only have the gun. And the gun is not the same thing as command. By the middle period of the war, the camp at Colditz had developed into something that the German military had not anticipated and did not know how to respond to. The British officers had built a complete alternative society inside the prison. They had a school. Prisoners taught each other languages, mathematics, history, law. They had a theater group that put on elaborate productions, plays, reviews, comedies. that were officially approved by the German command because they seemed harmless, and in which the British officers embedded layer after layer of jokes about their captors that were so well crafted, so layered in meaning, that German officers who attended and laughed along with the audience were often laughing at jokes made at their own expense without knowing it. They had a newspaper, a secret radio that received BBC broadcasts, a sophisticated system of communication between the different national contingents. They had essentially built a parallel command structure, parallel government, a parallel society that existed inside the German one and did not recognize German authority as legitimate. This was not just resistance. This was a declaration, a continuous, permanent, institutional declaration that said, "You may control the walls, you may control the gates, but you do not control us. You never have, you never will. You are not in charge." The commandant was not a stupid man. He understood gradually what was happening. He could see the signs, the way his orders were technically followed but never truly obeyed, the way his authority was performed but never actually felt, the way the British officers looked at him, not with fear, not with hatred, but with that steady, patient, slightly amused expression that communicated more clearly than any words. "We are waiting for you to finish." The way they had turned their captivity into something he did not control. He tried different approaches. He tried stricter rules. He tried increasing the frequency and duration of Appell to exhaust them, to force them into a submissive exhaustion. There was a moment, described later by British officers who witnessed it, that became the symbolic center of the whole story. The moment when the German command's loss of psychological authority became undeniable and final. It happened during a particularly tense period in the camp, when escape attempts had increased and German security had been tightened to a degree that made daily life genuinely more difficult. The commandant had called a full assembly, not a routine Appell, a formal assembly with guards positioned at every corner, with the commandant himself standing on an elevated step at the front of the courtyard. He had prepared a speech. He intended to remind the prisoners, clearly, forcefully, in terms they could not miss, of his authority, of the consequences of continued disobedience, of the reality of their situation. He began to speak. His voice was controlled and powerful. His bearing was military and precise. He listed the recent violations. He described the punishments that would follow. He spoke about the duty of prisoners under the terms of the Geneva Convention. He spoke about the limits of his patience. He spoke with the full weight of the German military behind him. And as he spoke, something began to happen in the rows of British officers. It was subtle at first, almost imperceptible, a shift in posture, a slight adjustment in how they were standing, an almost invisible change in their collective bearing. And then it became visible. One by one, with perfect, unhurried calm, the British officers stopped paying attention. Not all at once. That would have been too obvious, too easily punished. But one by one, like men who had suddenly remembered that they had something more pressing to think about, they allowed their attention to drift. Small movements, a gaze moving to the sky, a murmured exchange with the man next to them, the tiniest shift of weight, of posture, the faintest signal that they were present in body but completely, utterly absent in attention. By the time the commandant finished speaking, he was addressing a courtyard of men who were looking at him with the polite vacancy of people sitting through an announcement they already knew was irrelevant to them. He stopped. His last words hung in the cold air. Nobody moved. Nobody responded. And in the silence that followed, in that cold German courtyard with the frost on the stones and the guards at their posts and the barbed wire on the walls, the commandant looked at the rows of British officers and saw, with perfect clarity, that they were not afraid of him, that they had never been afraid of him, that he had been running a camp full of men who considered him a minor inconvenience for years. And there was nothing in his training, nothing in his authority, nothing in the entire apparatus of the German military behind him that was going to change that. What happened next was the moment people who were there never forgot. The British senior officer, the same man who had looked away from the commandant on that first day, the man with the calm eyes and the thin smile, took one step forward, just one step, out of his row, in front of everyone, guards, prisoners, every eye in the courtyard. He looked at the commandant, and he said, in a voice that was perfectly level and completely without aggression, because aggression would have been a form of engagement and this was something else entirely, "You have said enough. 3 words. That was all. You have said enough. Not a threat. Not a military challenge. A dismissal. The kind of thing a senior officer says to a junior officer who has gone on too long. The kind of thing a teacher says to a student who has misunderstood the assignment. The kind of thing that is only more devastating for being delivered with such quiet, such absolute certainty, that it cannot be mistaken for anything other than what it is. The commandant stared at him. Every guard in the courtyard stared. The other British officers stood in their rows and did not move and did not speak, but the quality of their silence, the weight of it, the solidarity of it, was the loudest sound in that courtyard. The commandant stood on his step in his polished boots with his medals and his rank and the full machinery of Nazi Germany behind him, and he looked at this one British officer standing one step out of line, and he could not speak. He could not find the words, because the words he had rehearsed, the words of authority, of punishment, of command, had nothing to land on. There was no fear to address. There was no submission to appeal to. There was no recognition of his power that he could build on. There was just this man, looking at him with patient contempt, and behind him hundreds of men who shared that contempt, and the absolute silence of people who have decided that the performance is over. He had the officer punished, of course. That was the automatic response of the system. 14 days in solitary, a reduction in privileges, a formal notation in the camp records. But even as he ordered the punishment, he knew, and every person in that courtyard knew, that the punishment was not an exercise of power. It was a performance, a mechanical response from a system that had lost the thing that made it real. The British officer accepted the punishment with the same expression he had worn throughout the entire exchange. Calm, faintly amused, entirely unbroken. He was escorted to his cell. And as he went, the British officers in the courtyard watched him go, and then they looked back at the commandant, and the commandant looked at their faces, and he saw it. The thing he had been trying not to see for months. They had won. Not the escape attempts, not the technical violations, the psychological war, the war for the space inside men's heads where authority lives or dies. He had lost it completely, and they knew it, and now he knew it too. The aftermath of these years in Colditz is not a simple story of triumph. It is something more complicated and more human than that. The war did not end at Colditz. The prisoners endured years more of captivity. They endured cold and hunger and the psychological weight of years separated from their families and their lives. Men broke under the strain. Men struggled. Men carried wounds from those years that never fully healed. This was not a comfortable captivity. It was grinding and hard and long. But the psychological war, the war for authority, for dignity, for the right to define themselves on their own terms, that war the British officers won. Not in a single dramatic moment. In thousands of small moments over years, in every smirk and every slow salute and every carefully timed pause before compliance, in every elaborate theater performance and every radio broadcast and every lesson taught in that makeshift school inside a Nazi prison. In every day they refused to be reduced to what their captors wanted them to be. When the camp was liberated in April 1945, the German guards and commanders who had spent years trying to break the men inside its walls found themselves, suddenly, on the other side of the power relationship they had constructed. The men who had been prisoners walked out. The men who had held the guns stood and watched them go. And the authority that the German command had believed was absolute, authority backed by the greatest military force in Europe, had not, in the end, been absolute at all. It had been conditional. It had been dependent on the cooperation of the men it claimed to control. And those men had decided very early on not to cooperate, not in the way that mattered. The commandants who served at Colditz went on to various fates after the war. Some were held for questioning. Some were tried. Some disappeared into the Germany that emerged from the rubble of the Third Reich. None of them found, in post-war life, the respect they had demanded from those rows of British officers in that castle courtyard.